The U.S.-Mexico border has long been a hotspot of tension, plagued by cartel activities, smuggling, and human trafficking. But recently, shocking revelations have surfaced. Revelations so explosive that the Navy SEALs reportedly tried to cover them up. In this video, we'll expose the untold truth behind the Navy SEALs' involvement and the alarming implications it holds. Stay tuned as we dive deep into this unprecedented story about the Mexican border that you won't want to miss. The truth revealed. On March 5th, Vice President J.D. Vance made a high-profile visit to the U.S.-Mexico border to promote Trump's immigration crackdown. The visit was packed with bold claims about dropping arrest numbers and tough new policies. But behind the scenes, a shocking discovery was waiting to be uncovered. Hidden beneath the ground, a secret tunnel connecting Ciudad Juarez in Mexico to El Paso, Texas was found. A revelation that cast a shadow over Vance's confident speech about border security. Before diving into the tunnel's discovery, let's start with Vance's visit. This wasn't just a typical photo op. It was a carefully orchestrated show of force. Alongside him were Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, making the whole event looked more like a military operation than a routine visit. The trio then took a helicopter ride over Eagle Pass, Texas, about 150 miles southwest of San Antonio, before heading to a Border Patrol facility. There, they held a round table with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and other officials, emphasizing how seriously the administration was taking border security. Vance came armed with numbers, proudly announcing that arrests for illegal crossings had dropped by 39% in January. At first glance, that sounds impressive, but there's more to the story. Those numbers had already been trending down before Trump started his second term. In fact, Mexican authorities had ramped up their own enforcement efforts, and the previous administration under Biden had implemented stricter asylum rules the previous summer. However, Vance wasn't about to let those facts cloud the narrative. According to him, it was Trump's hardline orders that were making the difference. But while Vance was busy touting the administration's progress, something far more alarming was being uncovered. A tunnel, stretching roughly 300 meters from Mexico to Texas. This wasn't just any tunnel. It was reinforced with wooden beams to prevent collapse and equipped with lighting and ventilation systems. Experts estimate it took at least a year to construct, making it clear this was a sophisticated operation, not some quick dig-and-dash setup. The tunnel was discovered back on January 10th, when border agents stumbled upon an entry hole hidden beneath a metal plate. They quickly alerted their Mexican counterparts, and now the tunnel is set to be sealed for good. Mexican officials were swift to declare their intention to close it off, but the big question remains, how did something like this go unnoticed for so long? Investigators are now digging into whether local officials might have turned a blind eye or were simply oblivious to the operation unfolding right under their feet. This tunnel discovery couldn't have come at a worse time for the Trump administration. After all the talk of enhanced border security and dropping arrest numbers, the fact that smugglers had managed to build such an elaborate passageway right under the border was more than a little embarrassing. It raises some uncomfortable questions about what else might be slipping through the cracks. Meanwhile, across the border, Mexico has been ramping up its efforts as well, though not entirely voluntarily. Under significant pressure from the U.S., Mexico has launched its largest ever migrant crackdown, moving migrants to southern states by bus and plane to keep them far from the U.S. border. However, this cooperation isn't without its tensions. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum isn't thrilled about playing defense for the U.S. while facing a different problem herself: the flood of weapons being smuggled south from the U.S. into Mexico. Sheinbaum's stance is clear. If the U.S. wants help with the migrant issue, it's time to talk about stopping the southbound flow of guns fueling cartel violence. Essentially, it's turned into a blame game. Trump is focused on mass deportations while Sheinbaum wants action on weapons smuggling. Both sides are pointing fingers, but neither seems eager to tackle both problems at once. The tunnel also highlights a harsh reality about the border crisis. It's about a lot more than just stopping people from crossing illegally. Smuggling networks have evolved, using everything from drones to catapults to get contraband across. If they've got the resources and expertise to build a tunnel like this one, it's worth considering what else they're capable of and how many other tunnels might already be in place. Vance himself admitted that the border situation has escalated into a national intelligence issue. That explains why he brought in the big guns, with the Defense Secretary and Director of National Intelligence at his side. This isn't just a matter for the Department of Homeland Security anymore. The administration is pulling in resources from across the federal government, suggesting they realize the situation is far more complex than just building walls and boosting patrols. But despite all the security measures and high-level visits, the existence of this tunnel raises some troubling questions. If one could be built and go unnoticed for over a year, clear, how many others might there be? And if a tunnel of this scale was only discovered by chance, what else might be slipping through undetected? It's a stark reminder that border security isn't just about stopping what you can see above ground, it's also about what's hidden beneath it. As if things weren't complicated enough, the tunnel discovery has sparked new tensions between U.S. and Mexican officials. While the U.S. is demanding tighter controls and more cooperation, Mexican leaders are frustrated by the focus solely on migrants while ignoring the weapons issue. Sheinbaum's administration has been vocal about this imbalance, arguing that the U.S. can't expect full cooperation on one front without addressing the other. This latest revelation also throws a wrench into Trump's border immigration crackdown plans. Sealing one tunnel might be a quick fix, but it does little to address the larger system at play. Smugglers aren't about to throw in the towel just because one route is closed. In fact, history shows they'll likely come back with even more sophisticated methods. And with the demand for crossing the border as high as ever, the reality is that these networks aren't going anywhere. So what does this all mean for Trump's immigration plans moving forward? For starters, it suggests that the administration's current strategy might not be enough. Walls, patrols, and policy changes are all well and good, but they don't mean much if smugglers are tunneling right under them. It's becoming clear that a more comprehensive approach is needed, one that includes intelligence gathering, full cooperation with Mexico, and perhaps most critically, addressing the weapons smuggling issue that Mexico is so concerned about. But for now, the focus remains on sealing that tunnel and figuring out how it went unnoticed for so long. The incident has put the administration on the defensive, with officials scrambling to downplay the significance of the discovery. Still, the optics aren't great. For an administration that spent so much time talking tough on border security, finding out that smugglers were literally digging tunnels under their feet doesn't exactly inspire confidence. In the end, this tunnel is more than just a secret passageway. It's a symbol of a much bigger problem, one that won't be solved by sealing a few holes in the ground. For now, the border battle is far from over, and if this discovery is anything to go by, it's only going to get more complicated. How Trump and his team choose to handle it could very well define the next chapter of this ongoing crisis. The border. To better understand the immigration issue at hand, it is necessary to have an understanding of the history of the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico border is nearly 2,000 miles long, stretching from the Pacific Ocean at California's San Diego to the Gulf of Mexico at Texas's Brownsville. Today, it's one of the most heavily guarded and controversial borders in the world, known for its high fences, surveillance drones, and thousands of Border Patrol agents. But it wasn't always this way. The history of this border is a complex story of wars, treaties, politics, and economics that transformed it from an open, largely ignored line into one of the most contested and dangerous boundaries on the planet. Along this border, illegal activities have flourished for decades, ranging from drug trafficking and human smuggling to gun running and even wildlife trafficking. Understanding how we got here requires going back nearly 2 centuries to when this line was first drawn. The origins of the border can be traced back to the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. At that time, the United States was in a land-hungry expansion phase known as Manifest Destiny, a belief that Americans were destined to spread across the continent. Texas had already broken away from Mexico and joined the United States, sparking a conflict that would last 2 years and end with a U.S. victory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 forced Mexico to cede nearly half its territory to the U.S., including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In exchange, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, a fraction of the land's value. The treaty also established the Rio Grande as the official border in Texas and drew a line westward to the Pacific. Just a few years later, the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 added what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico, securing a route for a southern transcontinental railroad and setting the border as we know it today. But even after these treaties, the border was more of an idea than an actual barrier. People crossed freely for decades. Many families lived on both sides, trading goods and moving cattle across the line without much interference. The real push to secure the border didn't come until the early 20th century, spurred by the Mexican Revolution, which sent thousands of refugees northward. Fearing instability, the U.S. began deploying soldiers to guard the border, but these early efforts were minimal at best. The first real wave of illegal activity at the border wasn't about people, it was about booze. During Prohibition in the 1920s, the border became became a smuggling hotspot. Mexican bootleggers moved tequila and whiskey northward, while American gangsters smuggled guns south to arm rebel groups in Mexico. This was when the U.S. first established border agents, but they were vastly outnumbered and often outgunned. Smuggling routes established during this time would later be used for narcotics trafficking, setting the stage for decades of illegal activity. By the 1940s, World War II had created a new challenge: labor shortages. To address this, the U.S. launched the Bracero program, a deal with Mexico to bring in temporary agricultural workers. Millions of Mexicans crossed the border legally to work in American fields and factories. But when the program ended in 1964, many workers stayed, leading to a surge in undocumented immigration. From the 1970s onward, illegal crossings skyrocketed, driven by economic instability in Mexico and violence in Central America. This was also when drug smuggling became a full-scale industry at the border. The 1980s saw the rise of Colombian drug cartels, who realized they could use Mexico as a gateway to smuggle cocaine into the U.S. They partnered with Mexican cartels, offering them a cut to move shipments north. But the Mexicans quickly saw the bigger picture and cut out the Colombians entirely, seizing control of the drug trade. By the 1990s, cartels like the Sinaloa and Tijuana were making billions smuggling cocaine, heroin, and marijuana into the U.S. To bypass security. Cartels turned to more creative methods, like underground tunnels. One of the earliest major tunnels was discovered in 1990, stretching from a house in Douglas, Arizona, to a warehouse in Mexico. It was equipped with lighting, ventilation, and a rail system to move drugs. Since then, over 230 tunnels have been found, some nearly a mile long and more sophisticated than city subways. In 2020, authorities discovered a tunnel stretching from Tijuana to San Diego, complete with an elevator and reinforced concrete walls. Drug smuggling also takes to the air and sea. Cartels use drones to carry small amounts of drugs over fences, and narco-submarines, homemade vessels designed to move tons of cocaine undetected, have been intercepted off the coast. In one case, a semi-submersible was caught, carrying more than 17,000 pounds of cocaine, worth over $200 million. But drugs aren't the only things being smuggled. Human smuggling has become a billion-dollar industry, with cartels and coyotes, professional smugglers, charging anywhere from $4,000 to $15,000 per person. These smugglers have no regard for safety, cramming migrants into trucks, leading them through scorching deserts, and even abandoning them if things get risky. In 2022 alone, over 850 migrants died trying to cross the border, the deadliest year on record. Some migrants are deceived into labor or sex trafficking to pay off their smuggling fees, making human trafficking a darker, more insidious side of border crime. Meanwhile, the flow of weapons southward is just as alarming. American guns, easily bought due to lax gun laws, are smuggled into Mexico to arm cartels. The ATF's botched Operation Fast and Furious in the late 2000s, which let firearms slip into cartel hands under the guise of tracking them, is a notorious example. Over 70% of guns recovered at Mexican crime scenes are traced back to the U.S., fueling the violence that has killed over 300,000 people in Mexico since 2006. Corruption greases the wheels of this illegal economy. From 2004 to 2018, more than 500 U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents were arrested for crimes like bribery and drug trafficking. In Mexico, entire police units have been found working directly for cartels. Cartels pay off officials, turning a blind eye to smuggling operations. In some cases, Mexican police have been seen escorting drug shipments across state lines. Wildlife trafficking is another issue. Exotic animals like rare reptiles and birds are smuggled into the U.S., while hazardous waste is dumped illegally south of the border, causing environmental damage that's rarely talked about. The challenges at the U.S.-Mexico border go even deeper when you consider the influence and power of the cartels themselves. These organizations aren't just drug traffickers, they're powerful paramilitary forces that control entire territories in Mexico. Their wealth and reach allow them to operate like shadow governments, collecting taxes, providing services, and enforcing brutal justice in the areas they control. This level of power makes the border not just a line between two countries, but a front line in a battle against organized crime that's both global and local. One of the most infamous cartels, the Sinaloa cartel, has been smuggling drugs across the border for decades. Founded by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the cartel built an empire on cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl trafficking. Their network of tunnels beneath the border is legendary, but they also use bribery and intimidation to keep their operations running smoothly. Even with El Chapo behind bars, the Sinaloa cartel remains powerful, now allegedly led by his sons known as Los Chapitos. Their ability to adapt and innovate, from using drones to drop bombs on rivals to laundering money through legitimate businesses, has made them nearly untouchable. Then there's the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, one of the fastest growing and most violent organizations in Mexico. Led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, CJNG has made a name for itself with brutal public displays of violence, including beheadings and assassinations of police officers and politicians. They've also diversified their operations to include illegal logging, oil theft, and arms trafficking. CJNG's presence at the border has escalated the violence as they battle for control of key smuggling routes into the U.S. The impact of cartel violence on border communities is devastating. Towns on both sides of the border live under the constant threat of shootings, kidnappings, and extortion. In Mexican border states like Tamaulipas and Chihuahua, journalists who report on cartel activity are regularly assassinated, making it one of the most dangerous regions for the press. Meanwhile, in American cities like El Paso, Laredo, and San Diego, gang violence linked to the cartels has become a significant problem. Local gangs act as distributors for drugs smuggled across the border, fueling turf wars and overdose crises. The opioid epidemic in the United States is a direct consequence of border smuggling. Most of the fentanyl entering the U.S. comes from Mexico, where cartels source precursor chemicals from China to manufacture the deadly drug. Fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin and has been responsible for over 100,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. in just the past few years. Cartels have found ways to press fentanyl into fake prescription pills, making it even more dangerous for unsuspecting users. Despite efforts to crack down, the sheer volume of drugs crossing the border makes it nearly impossible to stop. Despite billions spent on security, high fences, surveillance towers, and thousands of Border Patrol agents, the illegal activities continue. As long as there's a demand for drugs, cheap labor, and guns, the border will remain a battlefield. It remains a place where desperation meets opportunity, where poverty collides with wealth, and where law enforcement is always two steps behind. Now Trump recognizes that as long as these underlying issues persist, the flow of drugs, people, and weapons will continue, no matter how high the walls are built. Hence, he has to fashion a way to combat these threats. Trump versus Mexican border. When Donald Trump stepped into the political spotlight, one of his boldest promises was to build a big, beautiful wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. This wasn't just a campaign slogan. It was the backbone of his immigration policy and a symbol of his tough-on-border stance. But the wall was just the start. Trump's plan to combat illegal immigration and secure the border included deploying thousands of troops, pushing controversial policies like the Remain in Mexico program, and declaring a national emergency to divert billions in funding. His approach was as aggressive as it was divisive, sparking legal battles, environmental concerns, and a heated political debate that hasn't cooled down since. Let's start with the wall. During his 2016 campaign, Trump repeatedly promised to build a wall that would stretch across the entire 954-mile U.S.-Mexico border. He insisted it would stop illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and what he called an invasion of criminals and gang members. Not only that, but he claimed Mexico would pay for it. This promise was, of course, quickly dismissed by Mexico, whose leaders flatly refused to cover the cost. As a result, U.S. taxpayers were left to foot the bill, which turned out to be a lot higher than Trump initially suggested. What started as a $12 billion estimate soon ballooned to nearly $300 billion, considering the costs of construction, land acquisition, and maintenance. By the time Trump left office, only about 452 miles of new and replacement barriers had been built, far less than the full border length. And of that, a significant portion was just replacing existing fencing rather than extending the barrier into new areas. Although many of his supporters argued that even this partial construction was a win for border security, critics, however, saw it as a failure to deliver on a signature promise. The fact that much of the wall was built well within U.S. territory rather than directly on the border also led to the creation of pockets of land between the wall and the actual border. Migrants who reached these pockets could still apply for asylum, making parts of the wall essentially useless. Then there were the environmental impacts. The border region is home to endangered species like jaguars, pronghorns, and various birds and reptiles. Conservationists warned that the wall would cut through critical habitats and disrupt migration patterns, potentially pushing some species to the brink of extinction. Even insects like bees, which are crucial for pollination, would be affected. Legal challenges from environmental groups quickly followed, delaying construction and adding to the mounting costs. Smugglers, meanwhile, proved that a wall alone wouldn't stop them. In response to the new barriers, they turned to underground tunnels, drones, boats, and even catapults to move drugs and people across the border. Some used battery-powered saws to cut through the steel bollards in minutes. Others went under with tunnels stretching for miles, complete with lighting and rail systems. These tactics exposed one of the wall's biggest flaws. It might slow smugglers down, but it wouldn't stop them. When it became clear that the wall wouldn't be enough, Trump decided to boost military presence at the border. On March 1st, the U.S. military announced the deployment of nearly 3,000 additional troops, bringing the total to around 9,000. This included about 2,400 soldiers from the 2nd Stryker Brigade Combat Team and 500 from the 3rd Combat Aviation Brigade. Their mission wasn't to arrest migrants or get directly involved in law enforcement, but to support Border Patrol by providing logistics, surveillance, and administrative help. The sight of U.S. troops patrolling the border in armored personnel carriers like Strykers was a powerful image for Trump's supporters, but it has also sparked a backlash. Critics argued that using the military this way blurred the line between military and civilian law enforcement and questioned the legality of the move. The Posse Comitatus Act generally prohibits federal troops from engaging in domestic law enforcement activities unless explicitly authorized by Congress. Trump's administration argued that this deployment was different since the troops were there to assist, not arrest, but that didn't stop a wave of lawsuits challenging the decision. And then there was the National Emergency Declaration. With Congress refusing to fully fund his wall, Trump declared a national emergency at the southern border in 2019, allowing him to divert billions from the military budget to border security. This move was as controversial as it was unprecedented. Democrats accused Trump of abusing his emergency powers, arguing that illegal immigration was not the kind of crisis the law was meant to address. Lawsuits followed, and the courts were split, with some blocking the funding and others allowing it to go through. By the time Trump left office, the national emergency was still tangled up in legal battles. The legal fights didn't stop there. One of Trump's most controversial policies was the Remain in Mexico program, officially known as the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. This policy required asylum seekers from Central America to wait in Mexico while their claims were processed. Trump argued that this would stop migrants from disappearing into the U.S. while awaiting their hearings, but the reality was much darker. Migrants were left stranded in dangerous Mexican border towns, vulnerable to kidnapping, assault, and murder by cartels and human traffickers. Human rights organizations documented numerous cases of violence against migrants, and the policy faced multiple legal challenges. Still, the Supreme Court eventually allowed it to continue during Trump's presidency. If Remain in Mexico was controversial, the zero-tolerance policy was explosive. Under this approach, anyone crossing the border illegally was prosecuted, including asylum seekers. Since children couldn't be held in criminal detention facilities, they were separated from their parents and placed in shelters. The images of children in cages, separated from their parents, sparked a national outcry. Audio recordings of children crying for their parents only made things worse. Faced with overwhelming backlash, Trump eventually signed an executive order to end family separations. But by then, the damage was done. Hundreds of children remained separated from their families, and the administration struggled to reunite them even after the policy was reversed. Trump also tried to pressure Mexico into tightening its own border security by threatening tariffs. In 2019, he announced a plan to impose escalating tariffs on Mexican goods unless the Mexican government did more to stop Central American migrants from reaching the U.S. border. The threat worked, at least in the short term. Mexico deployed thousands of National Guard troops to its southern border and agreed to expand the Remain in Mexico policy. Border apprehensions dropped significantly, which Trump took as proof that his tough tactics worked. Critics, however, argued that the tariffs were just a temporary fix and did nothing to address the root causes of migration, like violence and poverty in Central America. In the end, Trump's border security strategy left a complicated legacy. The wall remains incomplete, with large sections still missing. The environmental and legal challenges continue. The troop deployment sparked debates about the role of the military in border security. The policies from Remain in Mexico to family separations were rolled back or significantly altered by the Biden administration. And the underlying issues driving migration, corruption, violence, and economic instability in Central America remain largely unaddressed. Whether you see Trump's border policies as necessary or as a humanitarian disaster depends a lot on where you stand politically. But what's clear is that they reshaped the immigration debate in the U.S. and left a series of legal, environmental, and diplomatic battles that are still being fought today. If you found this video informative, click on any of the cards on your screen to check out more trending stories about it.